Good evening. I'm Lawrence Peck, and I wanted to thank Doris and her wonderful organization, the Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors Los Angeles, for inviting me to make this presentation to you tonight. I'm actually a member of Doris's wonderful group. I guess I could say I'm on a hiatus because lately I haven't been attending. I've been busy working, as you'll see from my presentation, with some conservative groups, especially Korean conservatives, both here and in South Korea. I should say right off the bat that I'm not a professional speaker. I don't do it for a living. I'm no Norman Podhoretz or Dennis Prager. I often actually speak to Koreans, sometimes with translation, sometimes in halting Korean. So I hope you'll indulge me, please, if I refer to my notes, because I have a number of facts and figures that I'd like to refer to this evening. I'm not also the child of a Holocaust survivor. I know that many members of the group aren't, but I'd like to say I'm the child of a Holocaust ender, because my father, of blessed memory, served in the U.S. Navy as an officer during World War II. Thank you. My lecture tonight, I'd like to dedicate to two families which were butchered by terrorists, one in Israel and one in South Korea, the Republic of Korea. The one in Israel is the Fogel family, which in 2011 had their home entered by several Palestinian terrorists, and most of the family, those who hadn't been in the home at the time, escaped, but most of them, including the young children, were butchered by those terrorists in 2011. It was known as the Itamar massacre at that time. A very similar thing happened in South Korea many decades earlier in 1968, a family minding their own business in their home in the countryside. North Korean commandos, terrorists burst in, seeking to shelter in the home. They slaughter the family, including the children. In both cases, there's a similarity. They actually disfigured the children after slaughtering them, butchering them with knives. There's another similarity in that in both cases, left-wing elements in South Korea and in Israel made excuses for the killers, denied some of the facts of the case. In Israel, there were a couple of left-wing groups actually which went to the family of the killers and sympathized with them and commiserated with them and hugged them. There are actually pictures you can see of this on the internet, a pretty disgusting outcome, but I'd like to dedicate my speech to those families. North Korea is about 6,000 miles from us here in Los Angeles as the crow flies, but this geographic distance tends to obscure a certain political influence which they have here in our own backyard. I'm referring to a political influence in the political realm which they have in New York, in DC, throughout the University of California system, over in Glendale, in Santa Monica, and perhaps soon in West LA as a whole. I should say as the missile flies rather than as the crow flies, because as you may be aware, the North Korean long-range missiles are now able to reach the westernmost parts of the United States, the West Coast, and since they're also developing nuclear weapons, eventually they'll be able to latch on the nukes to their long-range missiles. Of course, these wouldn't be used for some kind of Cold War-style massive first strike. What they would be used for would be a form of nuclear blackmail, intimidation, to give them free rein in their part of the world for aggression there. The historical background of Korea is that they suffered under an extremely brutal Japanese colonial occupation from the early part of the 1900s until they were effectively freed from Japan in 1945 as a result of the U.S. defeat of Imperial Japan in the Second World War. After the war, U.S. troops entered the southern part of the Korean peninsula. Soviet troops entered the northern part, and that is how the division of what was always a single nation ensued. The Soviets, in their zone, installed a Stalinist-type political system. They built up massively the armed forces there, including many tanks and heavy weapons. The U.S., unfortunately, provided very little of that type of military aid to the south. No tanks or heavy weapons or those kinds of defensive materials. You can see that's leading to trouble. The Republic of Korea, as South Korea is called, became independent in 1948, the same year the State of Israel did. They have that in common. And speaking of World War II, which I mentioned briefly, there was one little anecdote I'd like to share about 10 years ago. A U.S. film crew went to North Korea and they visited there because they heard that the diary of Anne Frank was being taught there to North Korean students in the North Korean schools. I don't know if it was widespread, but it still is a great human interest story. And when the U.S. news crew went there, they interviewed a young student from the Communist Youth Group who was supposedly reading the Korean translation of Anne Frank, and they asked him about it. And they said, "What touched you really the most about the story? What impressed you about it?" And the young trained communist student said, "Well, I enjoyed reading the Korean translation very much, which the great leader provided to us for our education, but it was very sad. The end of the story was very heartbreaking, especially the part where the US imperialists kill Anne Frank. And that was a true story. So you can see what kind of education they're getting there. A communist dictatorship was set up in North Korea under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. South Korea was a capitalist country allied with the US, a republic. The US Army, which had been there since 45, pulled out in 1949. At that time, however, our forces throughout Asia as a whole were very weak. We had drawn down our military a lot after World War II. So by 1950, we really had a hollow, largely untrained force doing occupation duties in nearby countries like Japan, which of course invited aggression, which is whatever happens when a president decides to really slash the US military. Echoes of today. The North Koreans, seeing that this weakness as a provocation, as aggressors always do, massively invaded South Korea on June 25th, 1950, and the US and several other allied nations fought a seesaw war up and down the Korean peninsula for about 3 years until an armistice was finally signed. China had come into the war, and an armistice was finally signed between the US and the UN side and the Chinese and the North Korean aggressors on July 27th, 1953. A total of about 42,000 US troops from the various services made the ultimate sacrifice, killed in action or missing in action in that conflict. I remember one story I happened to be reading about Jewish heroes, Jewish military heroes of the United States, and there was a kind of an interesting sentimental story about one Jewish soldier serving in the Korean War, and he had received a terrible bullet gut wound right in the abdomen stomach area, and he was able to survive. What happened was when they operated him to take out the bullet, they thought that he wouldn't survive, but they found that there was almost no liquid or food in his system. He hadn't apparently eaten for a while, and the doctors determined that this had saved his life. He hadn't actually been digesting food at the time. His system was clear of most food and liquid, and they asked him as he was recovering in the hospital, how did this come about? That, you know, for 24 hours prior to being wounded, you didn't have any food or water in your system. And he replied to them, well, it just so happens that it was Yom Kippur, and he had been fasting for Yom Kippur, and that fact saved his life. A true story of the Korean War for you. There's a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, which has separated the North and the South from the signing of the armistice in '53 up until today. It really bisects the peninsula of Korea. The South Koreans have their armed forces which defend against the North, in addition to which there are approximately 28,000 US forces at this time stationed in the South, mostly, of course, Army, as you would expect. Since 1953, the end of the war, however, that doesn't mean that peace has reigned on the peninsula. The North Koreans have been waging their own low-intensity terrorist and sometimes conventional war against the South Koreans with various levels of attacks and incursions into the South. Some of the more famous of these attacks and incursions include, back in 1968, the North Korean seizure in international waters of the US ship Pueblo. You may remember that from the headlines many decades ago. They killed a couple crew members, kept the crew hostage for about a year. In 1968, the same year, they staged a commando raid on the residence of the president of South Korea. Unsuccessful, but a number of people were killed. In '69, they shot down over international airspace a US reconnaissance aircraft, killing everyone on board. Throughout the 1970s, they would dig tunnels under the demilitarized zone into South Korea. And I don't mean small kind of prisoner of war escaping through the tunnels type of tunnels. I mean large industrial type tunnels that you could drive a small motor vehicle through. In other words, they were invasion tunnels. Some of them have been found. Some of them to this day, we don't know where they're located. In '76, there was a particularly serious incident, the infamous Panmunjom axe murders. At the border between North and South, some US troops, fully within their rights, were trimming a tree that was blocking their view of the northern side. North Korean troops approached them, beat them, seized the axes that they were trimming the trees with, and hacked two US officers to death at that time. In 1983, a South Korean high-level government delegation was visiting Burma. A North Korean agent planted a bomb at one of their stops in Burma and blew up a number of high-ranking members of the South Korean government there. In '87, they placed a bomb, a North Korean agent did, on a Korean Air jetliner, blowing it out of the sky, killing over 100 people. They were hoping to derail the '88 Seoul Olympics. That's why they had done that just before it. In 2010, most recently, there were two large provocations which the North staged. staged. One was the sinking of a South Korean warship in 2010. The warship was called the Chun'an, and a North Korean submarine sunk it off the coast of Korea. And also, you may remember from 2010, they shelled for quite a number of hours a South Korean island that sits just off the coast of Korea, and they killed a number of people on that island at that time. The official name of North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Note that prefix, Democratic Peoples, where South Korea is just the Republic of Korea. You always get into trouble, I notice, when you add prefixes to words. They can sometimes turn words or names into their opposite, just like we can see from the words social justice versus justice. Social justice, in my opinion, perverts the notion of justice. Kim Il-sung, who I mentioned was the founder of North Korea, he ruled that country until his death, with the assistance of his son, ruled it until 1994, whereupon his son was became the dear leader, took over, although he was really running things before his father died. And then Kim Jong-il, who subsequently died in 2011, was succeeded in a dynastic form by his son, the current leader, the young man Kim Jong-un. So you can see that they have the first dynastic succession in the history of any communist state, in addition to which they have a huge, horrific cult of personality, even exceeding that of Mao in China or Stalin in the Soviet Union. The Kim family is worshipped as gods there, and they instill that in their population. North Korea has the dubious distinction also of being probably the worst human rights abuser in the world, bar none. They keep approximately 150 to 200,000 of their own people in concentration camps. They execute Christians. They have huge internal purges even within the communist leadership. You may remember Kim Jong-un had his uncle killed. That's an example of that. Cult worship, worship of the Kim family, the three generations as virtual gods. No freedom, obviously, of religion or of movement. They also assign all of their benighted citizens a certain classification upon birth. They have different classes which they assign to people officially in their official records, and that determines someone's whole future and whole life in a horrible way. Very little contact with the outside world, particularly for average citizens. Some people have likened it as the country which most resembles that depicted in George Orwell's work 1984. Perhaps most ominously, there were reports which first began to surface about 10 years ago of the gassing by the North Korean government, the use of poison gas to murder various dissidents, people who they had locked up in concentration camps. Rabbi Cooper of the Simon Wiesenthal Center actually interviewed one of the witnesses of this gassing, and Rabbi Cooper's been doing a lot of work nationally to fight against the human rights abuses that go on in North Korea. Speaking of the Wiesenthal Center, I'd just like to remind all you folks, in case you've forgotten, that a few years ago, when Jimmy Carter started his, in earnest, his anti-Israel campaign, slandering it with all these libels, he got in a fight with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and he wrote them a letter saying, on his own stationery, Jimmy Carter did, saying, all you folks at the Wiesenthal Center only care about money. Just wanted to remind you that he did that. In 1999, there was actually an intelligence report, a US government report, which indicated that North Korea had had connections with bin Laden and Al-Qaeda as of that time, 99. Of course, the North Koreans had an important presence in the Middle East with some of our adversaries. They actually did a big missile deal with Saddam Hussein before he was removed from power. But the North Koreans got the best of it because they got the cash from Saddam, but they never were able to deliver the missile. So they got a nice windfall out of that. Probably their closest relationship in that region is with Iran. They've had over the past several decades a very close relationship since the Iranian Revolution with the regime of the mullahs. They cooperate particularly on their nuclear weapons and their missile programs. As a matter of fact, it's been reported that some of Iran's missiles that you often hear about in the news, for example, the Shahab missiles, are actually copies of models which were originally modified or developed further in North Korea. Of course, this is all proof of what former President Bush called the axis of evil, which he was roundly condemned for at the time, you may recall. North Korean-trained terrorists have been killing Americans and others for quite a few years. Puerto Ricans and Israelis killed by Japanese terrorists trained and armed by North Korea at the infamous Lod Airport massacre in Tel Aviv in 1972. In that incident, 26 were killed, including Aharon Katzir, who was a brilliant scientist and who had a younger brother who 1 year later actually became president of Israel. Some of the Japanese Red Army terrorists who were involved were captured. One of their leaders was later exchanged in one of these prisoner exchanges, which which unfortunately often happen. He was sent to Lebanon, and the Lebanese government gave him asylum there as a quote-unquote resistance fighter, in spite of the fact that the Japanese government was trying to have him extradited. There were Israelis also killed by Hezbollah rockets made in North Korea and shipped to Hezbollah in Lebanon via Iran and Syria. There were Koreans, such as those I alluded to earlier, who were killed over the many decades by North Korean infiltrators and attacks across the DMZ. Yasser Arafat actually made 6 visits that we know of to North Korea, friendship visits, and to some other PLO leaders such as Habash of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine had also visited North Korea. He actually announced in North Korea that he was becoming a communist because Habash was a member of the communist wing of the PLO, and that he was actually in Pyongyang, North Korea, where he made that announcement. The North Koreans have had a long and close relationship with the PLO over many decades and with all of their subgroups, as I've indicated. They provide them with training and arms. They've even trained them, the PLO and the PFLP, in Lebanon. The North Koreans would send advisors to Lebanon to train some of the terrorist groups there, particularly during the civil war period of Lebanon when there was anarchy. North Koreans, many people don't realize, actually came in direct contact and conflict with the Israeli armed forces, because in the Yom Kippur War of '73, North Korean pilots actually flew Egyptian fighter aircraft. The same also is reported with Syria. They also helped out in the Syrian Air Force. Even today, there are a lot of reports of North Koreans serving with the Syrian forces in their brutal massacre of the opposition there. You may remember back in 1982, what was up until that time the worst massacre in Syria, because no one expected what would be the extent of the massacre now. There was an infamous massacre known as the Hama massacre, and it was also been reported that North Koreans were directly involved in that atrocity. In the 2006 war, which Israel waged with Hezbollah on the border of Lebanon and in northern Israel, you may recall that the Israeli Air Force had a lot of difficulty in that war because they were trying to use bunker-busting bombs to penetrate a very well-developed series of tunnels and underground shelters which Hezbollah had built in southern Lebanon. Those were reportedly made with North Korean help. They're expert tunnel builders because of what they're doing on the Korean Peninsula, and they applied that technology to help Hezbollah in that respect. Also, it's been reported that Sheikh Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, in earlier decades, actually went for some of this terrorist training in North Korea. Most recently, in 2010, the authorities in Thailand seized one of those huge cargo planes filled with 35 tons of arms, and it was discovered that these were probably heading to Hezbollah and Hamas, and the arms were from North Korea. Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, our so-called partners for peace and the partners for peace of the Israeli government, there still remain very close ties to the dictatorship in North Korea. Whenever there's some kind of event or celebration there, they send their warm greetings. They instruct their ambassador to give lovely gifts to the dictator there, Kim Jong-un, as they did with his predecessor, Kim Jong-il. The Palestinians, in their own way, help promote and spread the personality cult of the Kim family. North Korean efforts in the Middle East, though, have not always been successful. There was one kind of funny, in an unconscious way, incident that they were involved in. As you know, they try to spread their cult of the Kim family all over the world. They have books that they publish in dozens of languages to spread the word far and wide about the heroic exploits of Kim Il-sung and his progeny. They had one that they translated into Arabic for Arab progressives to kind of convert them to the cause of North Korea. And the problem is that they sought a local translator. I guess they had a local North Korean who speaks Arabic translate the book instead of getting an Arab native speaker. The name of the book was Kim Il-sung is Our God. But when they translated it into Arabic and distributed it in the Middle East, they came in for a lot of trouble because the title came out as Kim Il-sung is Our Allah. And as you can imagine, that didn't go over too well with some of the fanatics in the Middle East for obvious reasons. Closer to home, North Korea in 1983 placed some kind of an electronic listening device on a little island off of the Baja Peninsula down in Mexico, which we found and removed. They were apparently trying to listen in on some of the military bases in the San Diego area. North Korea has been involved in kidnapping, drug dealing, arms selling to terrorists, counterfeiting U.S. currency. That's one of the reasons we have these new $25 bills which emerged a few years ago. It's because the North Koreans were specializing in counterfeiting those along with the $100 bills. A lot of people have likened North Korea to a Sopranos state because they get a huge chunk of their national income. Some have estimated up to 40% from these illegal activities across the world. Their diplomats are always getting expelled from various countries for dealing drugs and things of that nature. There was a North Korean spy actually right here in LA who was arrested about 10 years ago. His name was John Ye. He was arrested and convicted. He ran a little snack shop in Santa Monica, but he was working as a North Korean agent. He got money from North Korean sources overseas, and his job was to recruit North Korean agents here in Southern California. He lived out here in the valley, as a matter of fact, not too far from this location. One terrorist group, an Islamic terrorist group, which the North Koreans were a big provider of arms to, happens to be called the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. That's a group in the southern islands of the Philippines which seek to set up an Islamic state and attack the Philippine government. Interestingly, North Korea, it seems, is no longer their #1 preferred arms supplier. North Korea had been a big arms supplier to them, but if you followed the news last week, Democratic State Senator Leland Yee was arrested and charged with providing or planning to provide sophisticated weapons to this very group. So I guess they found a new source for their weapons, no longer the North Koreans, Senator Yee. Meanwhile, while all this was going on that I've explained to you about North Korea, South Korea has over the past few decades blossomed into a full democracy and is now the economic miracle that we can see just by turning on our televisions. In 1957, South Korea actually had a lower GDP than the newly independent nation of Ghana in West Africa, whereas by 2010, they were already the 13th largest economy in the world, and they might have even gone up in the ranking since then. From living in Korea, I can tell you that there are more TGI Fridays restaurants in the Seoul area, the capital, than there are in all of Southern California. Here you have to drive 30 minutes to get to one. When I was there, 2 of the hot selling items also were Manischewitz grape wine, and bagels were very popular. When you think about it, who dreamed, as we were all seem to be have been around in the 1970s, that at that time, 30 years, 40 years later, we'd all be using LG and Samsung electronics and driving around in Hyundais. It was inconceivable. They have a small Jewish community in South Korea, which I participated in. They have a Chabad house, like they have in virtually every other country in the world which will allow them to have one. And interestingly, South Korean students actually study the Talmud as a guide to life. If you walk into a South Korean bookstore, you'll see, of course, not the full Talmud, but various excerpt-type books of it in 6 or 7 different editions. South Korea also has a very strong Christian Zionist movement. Christian denominations there who are very supportive of the state of Israel. You all know what Christian Zionists are, of course. Those are the people who are always being slandered and attacked in the pages of the LA Jewish Journal. South Korea actually was very interested in Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile system for obvious reasons. They have the threat from the north, and they do a lot of high-tech exchange with Israeli high-tech companies. When I was in Korea in the 90s, I actually had a chance to meet Natan Sharansky because he was there in South Korea as part of a trade mission. The South Koreans were good allies of the U.S. traditionally. They supported us by sending a number of troops to Vietnam to help us in the Vietnam War. More recently, they did the same in Afghanistan and in Iraq, supporting us with troops there. They have a lot in common with the U.S. culturally because they're the second most Christian nation in Asia, only after the Philippines, which is the first most. In South Korea, however, they do have anti-U.S., pro-North Korean extreme left forces. Of course, these are opposed by pro-US conservative forces there. One of the things that always shocks me when I survey South Korean politics and the ideological scene there is how not only similar it is to that of the US, but how shockingly similar it is to here in the United States. The big issues in South Korean democratic politics are taxes, national security, union power, education reform. And I'm sure this will all shock you, really stun you, but the centers of leftist power within South Korea are the elite universities, the mainstream media, the film and entertainment community. Does any of that sound familiar to you? In South Korea, it tends to go something like this. The left-wing forces and parties tend to be anti-US. The right-wing forces and parties are pro-US, and the same with Israel. The right tends to be pro-Israel, the left anti-Israel. Sometimes there are demonstrations, like they have here in LA or anywhere else in the world, in front of the Israeli embassy in Korea. Very, very infrequently there, because it's not a #1 issue on the agenda, but you'll see some local Muslims and the pro-North Korean folks protesting in front of the Israeli embassy there, but it's not something that happens too common. One phenomenon that's very similar in South Korea and here is we have our own what we call limousine leftists, limousine liberals, and they have their own there, although there, if you remember the song Gangnam Style, the big hit about a year ago from South Korea, Gangnam is the very wealthy Beverly Hills-like area of Seoul. So there they don't call them limousine liberals, they call them Gangnam liberals because it's the wealthy, the upscale area of Seoul. The South Korean progressives themselves refer to themselves as progressive, just as our left-wing forces do. The good news is that the South Korean conservatives, the pro-US, pro-Israel forces, are gaining in influence in their society. They have their own magazines, they have their own organizations, they even have their own cable TV station, which supports them. They follow our trends very closely. They report on the disaster that was Obamacare. They review Mark Levin's latest books. They have a pro-US political party there, a conservative party called the Say Nuri Party, which is currently the ruling party of President Park. I happened to meet with some folks from that party, some youngsters who were working in the offices there a couple of years ago, and they looked very downhearted and depressed. And I said, what's the matter? They said, we're suffering from tremendous stress. We have a big problem fighting the left. And I said, what's the issue? What's the problem you're facing? And they said, well, you wouldn't understand it being an American because the political culture is so different. I said, well, lay it on me. Let me hear what the problem is. I've studied Korean politics a little. Maybe I can come up with a suggestion. They said, well, it would be completely alien to you. You wouldn't know what we're talking about, but here it is. Here in Korea, we have this huge problem because every time there's a large election ready to occur, there are a bunch of left-wing movie stars and celebrities which call us all these nasty names, our party. So after about 10 minutes of uncontrolled laughter, I calmed myself down and I explained to them that all started in Hollywood, where I'm from, which they were amused to hear. In 2003, unfortunately, the people of South Korea made a bit of a mistake. There was an economic downturn as a result of the worldwide economic downturn, which we felt after 9/11, and the South Koreans made the mistake of electing an unqualified, very far-left community activist and lawyer to be their president. Some Koreans even believe he held his own nation in contempt. And if that sounds familiar to anyone, I'll leave that all up to you to judge. Since then, however, they tired of that left-wing leadership and the appeasement policies which they fostered toward the North. And as a result, in 2008, there was sworn in a very conservative pro-US president, followed more recently by the current president, who was sworn in early 2013, the first woman president of South Korea, which is saying a lot for that kind of an East Asian society. Her name is Park Geun-hye, President Park. Her father was leader of South Korea in the 60s and 70s. The North Koreans tried to assassinate him on at least 3 occasions, and they failed. But they did succeed, the North Koreans did, in murdering her mother, assassinating President Park's mother in 1974. President Park, because she's so pro-US and because she's a conservative, the left-wing forces both in Korea and here in the US call her a Nazi and a US stooge and all these nasty names. South Korea has its left-wing fringe truthers, just like we have here in the US. When the North Koreans sank that South Korean warship in 2010, some left-wing forces in South Korea and some Korean-American leftists here in Southern California denied that the North was responsible. The same with the North Korean attack on that island in 2010, the shelling of that island. Eerily, if you remember back to Pastor Jeremiah Wright, there was even in South Korea one far left-wing crazy pastor who actually got up and said, we South Koreans deserved what we got in that North Korean attack. So they've got a Pastor Wright as a Korean version over there in Seoul. One aspect which you may find totally bizarre, although if you're a little familiar with the history of anti-Semitism, it may ring some bells, and that is when the South Korean ship Cheonan was sunk, the pro-North Korean forces throughout the world, especially in South Korea, but some here, had to think up an excuse to get North Korea off the hook. So they came up with a new theory. They said that the South Korean warship Cheonan was actually sunk not by North Korea, but by the Jews. That was their theory. Not a blood libel, maybe a saltwater libel. I listened, when I was in South Korea, I used to listen in the evenings. I would tune in on the radio to the American Forces Radio and Television Network. They had AM radio broadcasts that they would broadcast for the US troops there, and I actually heard Rush Limbaugh. I would listen to him in the evenings. The local Democrats, because they're American, there's a big expat community, there are Democratic and Republican clubs in Seoul. They tried a petition campaign to get him off, but hopefully he's still on the air there. They also had North Korean propaganda broadcasts on AM, and you could also hear the North Koreans in English. They had English propaganda broadcasts aimed at the rest of the world and at Americans in South Korea and at our troops and what have you. And I remember one night I was listening and I heard a woman get on and she was strongly denouncing in the most vile terms the US military, accusing them of all these outrages and crimes. And I was thinking, oh, that's just the usual North Korean propaganda. But when station ID came, I realized it wasn't the North Korean broadcast, it was the American Armed Forces Radio, and it was our old anti-Zionist friends. It was a program from National Public Radio, which was featuring this lady slandering the US military. Interesting, I was at UCLA about a month ago, and they invited this same woman to come and speak at UCLA to deliver her same anti-US military screed at UCLA. I was recently speaking to a fellow conservative, and he knows of my interest and my expertise in the field of North Korea, and he really wanted me to give him a briefing, let him know what was going on there, what was the latest, any information I could share with him. I told him I'd prefer to talk about what was going on with US politics, if Hillary was running, what was going on with Bill and Hillary and their opponents, but I finally gave in to him because I knew that he wanted to know a lot about what was going on in the North, and I began to brief him on what was going on with the Kim regime in North Korea, and I said the key to understanding it is that you have basically this dysfunctional family which worships power absolutely, which has no political scruples or principles whatsoever, and they're willing to crush any opponent just like a bug under their feet. And my friend got very angry at me and he said, Lawrence, I thought you agreed not to talk about the Clintons. In 1993-94, when I was actually in Korea, there was a huge nuclear crisis on the Korean peninsula, 93-94. What happened was, a couple of years earlier, 91-92, we had gone through with a goodwill gesture, a confidence-building measure to show our good faith. We removed all of our nuclear weapons from South Korea, 91-92. We were paid back by the North Koreans in 93-94 by them suddenly pulling out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's how they responded to our goodwill. That caused a huge war scare and crisis on the Korean peninsula. You may remember Jimmy Carter made a famous visit there, I should say an infamous visit at that time, to try and find a way out of this and prevent war. He went to the North. The deal which resulted as a result of Carter's trip there was, in my opinion, the biggest mistake, the biggest case of appeasement since the Munich crisis in 1938, when Chamberlain gave a chunk of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. When Carter was there in 94, he praised Kim Il-sung, he praised North Korea often. He even went so far as to say that Kim Il-sung was very friendly towards Christians and Christianity, which is a bizarre statement if I've ever heard one. He referred to Kim Il-sung as the great leader of the Korean people, pretty disgusting. But the most disgusting thing was what happened as a result of his trip, that this deal was hammered out between the Clinton administration and North Korea, which came to be known, this negotiated agreement, as the 1994 Agreed Framework. And this agreed framework was the rubric under which Clinton would give huge concessions and benefits to the North Koreans based on the promise that they would freeze their nuclear program and allow certain inspections of it. As a result of this, we gave upfront billions in dollars of aid to the North, including oil and food, and we actually started building them as part of an international consortium. We actually started building them their own nuclear reactors. The problem was, and you've probably already guessed this, the North Koreans were cheating from the very beginning of the agreed framework. Even before the ink was dry, they were cheating. What happened was, the agreed framework related to their plutonium nuclear program, because you know you can make nuclear weapons via plutonium or uranium. What we didn't realize was they all along had a secret, highly enriched uranium nuclear program. Each time when President Clinton was in office, the North Koreans would do something provocative, like firing a long-range missile over Japan into the ocean. And each time they did it, Clinton would ask them to stop, and then get them to stop by rewarding them, promising them more aid and more concessions. And this happened several times during his presidency. President Clinton actually canceled some major military drills between the US and South Korean forces in this climate of appeasement. There was a moratorium actually on US criticism of North Korea's horrific human rights abuses. Even the Voice of America was prevented from doing a broadcast that they wanted to do at that time about North Korean human rights. In letters to the North Korean leadership, Clinton would address them respectfully, as Carter had done. At that time, it was Kim Jong-il, so he would address it to dear leader Kim Jong-il. In 1994, when the Republicans took over Congress, they actually held hearings on the agreed framework, and it came out in those hearings that the US intelligence community had predicted that North Korea probably would cheat on the agreed framework agreement. Of course, the Democrats in Congress denied this. Clinton's point man on North Korea was one Robert Gallucci. He actually admitted in testimony before Congress that North Korea might not abide by this agreed framework deal. Nevertheless, in the political campaigns in 94, 96, and 2000, the Democrats were boasting of this nuclear freeze with North Korea, which was, of course, fake. From 1996 to 2001, the Clinton years, the U.S. gave North Korea about 1.7 million metric tons in food aid. This is in spite of the fact that the reigning ideology of North Korea at that time, as espoused by Kim Jong-il, was known as Jong-un, which means army first. And under that ideology, any foreign aid which the country received, any domestic product, went first and foremost primarily to building up their military, not to feed people. In spite of that, we were providing them with these huge amounts of aid that they were diverting to their army. Of course, when anyone complained about it, left-wing forces in the U.S. would cry, "Food aid must not be used as a weapon. No matter what they do, we have to keep shipping them the food." One big hitch emerged, though, in this Clinton administration policy around 96, 97. In 97, Clinton's State Department spokesperson, Jamie Rubin, the husband of our anti-Zionist friend Christiane Amanpour of CNN, Mr. Rubin was having a press briefing at the State Department, and he denied the Republican charges that massive amounts of food aid were being diverted by the North Koreans into their military. He denied these charges. The hitch was, around that same time period, there was a North Korean submarine which was trying to infiltrate commandos, as they do from time to time, into the South. But on this occasion, the submarine got grounded on the coast of Korea. And when U.S. and South Korean forces went to search the submarine, they found tins of food in the submarine that these commandos were feasting themselves on. And when they looked at the cans, they saw they had English labels. And what did the labels say? The labels said things such as, "Food for relief in the name of Christ, donated food not for resale." So we see there where the food was going, regardless of what Jamie Rubin was telling the public. As North Korea was secretly violating the agreed framework, as they were counterfeiting our currency, as they were using our aid to feed their army, not their people, the U.S. gave a total of $13 billion in all forms of aid to the U.S. As a matter of fact, under President Clinton, we were the #1 aid giver in the world to North Korea. Of course, the South Korean leftist governments, which were in power from 98 to 2008, have a share of the responsibility, the blame for that, because the left-wing governments in power in South Korea gave another $10 billion to the North Koreans in aid. North Korean general actually visited the U.S. as an envoy from Kim Jong-il toward the end of the Clinton term in the White House. He toured around Washington in a nice three-piece Western suit, but before going into a photo op with Clinton in the White House, he changed into his North Korean general's uniform, and for the photo op, you can actually see him wearing the medals that he won for killing Americans in the Korean War as a young soldier. Also, at the very end of Clinton's term, Secretary of State Albright made a last-minute visit to North Korea to meet with Kim Jong-il. She praised Kim Jong-il when she was there. She participated in some of the mass cult performances that they have to celebrate the leader there, and she sang along with some young North Korean children who, unbeknownst to her, were singing anti-U.S. hate songs. Albright actually delisted North Korea as a rogue state. She said from then on, it would only be known for the rest of the Clinton administration as a state of concern. In 2002, after President Bush had come into office, there was a huge news story which erupted late in that year. What happened was we were continuing to negotiate with the North Koreans, and one of our top State Department negotiators was in Beijing, China, negotiating with the North. And that's when this thunderclap struck. The North, instead of their usual antics at these negotiations, they looked straight at our negotiator and they said, "You know what? We've been cheating on the agreed framework for all of these years. We have a secret nuclear program we never told you about." And then all heck broke loose, because after all, we had assumed that they were abiding by this agreement struck by Bill Clinton. Of course, this posed a major hurdle, a huge crisis for Hillary Clinton, politically speaking, because this was one of the major legacies of the Clinton administration. She had to think very fast. So what she did is she went into denial mode, and she stayed in that mode for about a decade. What happened was she was a senator by that time, Hillary was, and she denied that the North Koreans admitted it. It was all a Bush administration lie. The North Koreans never admitted they were cheating. They never admitted they had this secret uranium program that we didn't know about. She even went after and persecuted the young State Department translator who was at that meeting in Beijing, who translated the North Koreans basically not even saying, "Yes, we cheated," but "Hell yes, we cheated." She went after him. You know, "Are you sure they said this?" Maybe they said, "No, we're not cheating." She pulled out all the stops in order to cover up the fact that the North Koreans were cheating. She didn't do this just for a couple of years either. As I mentioned, she did this for about a decade. Even after she was named Secretary of State by President Clinton, she kept up this pattern of denial all through the Bush years up until just recently. She denied, she would always cast doubt on whether the North Koreans actually admitted this, whether they had this uranium program. Now, this is in spite of the fact that when the North Koreans, during that period of the early 2000s, had to submit certain documentation to the International Atomic Energy Agency. When they had to submit these papers, after they did so, the UN discovered that the documentation which the North submitted had traces of highly enriched uranium on it. That didn't faze her. Later, when Libya, you may remember, also in the early 2000s, gave up their nuclear program under the Bush administration, it was discovered when we were assessing the source of their nuclear components that the Libyans had in their stockpile highly enriched uranium, the source of which was North Korea. That didn't alter Hillary's denials. Hillary, however, went completely silent and stopped her denials cold in 2010. All of a sudden, no more statements that North Korea really didn't have this, or it was in doubt, or we shouldn't believe the Bush administration. All that stopped in 2010 because what happened was the North Koreans invited a number of important US scientists to their country, and they gave them a tour of their highly enriched uranium plant, and they showed it to them. Now, of course, you're probably thinking that hopefully some brave reporter who has the guts to take on Hillary, if she runs for president, will go up to her and ask her about this. And we'll ask her, why did you deny this for 10 years after the North Koreans had admitted it? Of course, Hillary has the perfect answer. She can easily get out of this. She'll use her Benghazi line. She'll look at the reporter or she'll look at the camera and she'll say, what difference at this point does it make? She's got the Benghazi excuse all prepackaged and ready. Having enabled North Korea to massively expand its nukes, when President Bush was in office, Democrats and liberals blamed Bush for North Korea having this nuclear capability. And in the process, they helped cover up for North Korea and tried to damage US-South Korea relations. There was one Democratic Party operative named Nancy Soderberg. She was #3 person in the National Security Council under Clinton. She actually lied about Bush having supposedly insulted the president of South Korea when they met in DC in 2002. The folks in the meeting denied it. Reporters who were covering it denied it. Former US ambassadors who were personal friends of the president of South Korea denied it. Apparently, she just made it up out of whole cloth to make Bush look bad. She was also a supporter of the agreed framework disaster. Secretary of State Albright under Clinton and former President Carter really exploded when Bush made his statement saying that Iran and North Korea are part of an axis of evil. They said that Bush saying that in itself was dangerous and provocative. Gore's national security advisor, Leon Firth, said that the fact that the North Koreans had nuclear weapons was Bush's fault, and he said it was deeply immoral for the US to stop giving all that aid to North Korea. In 2003, Howard Dean, when he was running for president, said that North Korea would probably give up its nukes if we just did a few things that they wanted us to do. You have to remember about Howard Dean, though. A few years ago, there's a clip of his which is often still to this day played on radio, which is very amusing. A few years ago, when he was head of the DNC, he was on a local radio program, and people were calling him up, the usual assortment of nuts, and one nut said to him, you know, Chairman Dean, I think Bush knew about 911 in advance. I think he was responsible. But the shocking thing was Dean, head of the DNC at that time, didn't say, listen, that's crazy talk. What Dean said was, oh, that's a very interesting theory. We'll have to look into that. Amazing. Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, who we all know and love so much for his pearls of wisdom that he shares with us every so often, in 2004, when he was also running for president, he said the whole problem was the US had never really dealt in good faith with North Korea. That was his take on the situation. New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, who sometimes in the past has had presidential aspirations, he visits the North frequently, pushes appeasement policies towards them. When he's there, he provides nice gifts to, at that time, Kim Jong-il, and if he goes there again, he may even provide some nice gifts to the current dictator. Of course, then there's our own towering intellect here in California. And when I say towering intellect, you probably know who I'm talking about, Senator Barbara Boxer. She reacted to Bush's calling North Korea and Iran part of an axis of evil by saying that Bush wasn't smart. Because if Bush were really smart, he would know that these countries couldn't be allies because they're different countries. They're different countries, so they can't be allies. You know, Hugh Hewitt, the local radio host on his show, he always says on his show, you know, Barbara Boxer's just as dumb as a brass rail. And I got furious at you when I said that. I said, you, that is not very nice. I called him out. I said, you owe an apology to every brass rail in this country. President Carter actually tried to reprise his disastrous 1994 visit to North Korea. He went back in 2010, and he went back right after these two massive North Korean provocations, after they sunk the warship Cheonan and after they shelled that South Korean island, Yeongpyeong Island. And everyone expected that when Carter would go there, he would show some solidarity with the South Koreans and denounce the North. Well, he did do some denouncing when he went there. Recently, President Carter, a few years ago, but who he was denouncing was the South Koreans and Americans. You see, he said that since the US and South Korea were no longer providing this massive aid to North Korea, that the US was, in fact, oppressing and denying the North Korean people their human rights by refusing to provide all this aid to him. As you can imagine, the South Korean media went berserk when Carter came up with this nonsense, and they ran huge editorials at the time saying, Mr. Carter, your role on the Korean Peninsula is finished forever. We no longer have any faith for you if you could make that kind of a crazy statement. Carter actually opposes sanctions against North Korea, even human rights related sanctions he opposes, but he's on record as supporting sanctions against Israel, which, although I'm no Talmudic scholar, reminds me of a line from the Talmud, that those who are kind to the cruel usually end up being cruel to the kind, a perfect description of Carter's views. In 2012, even the British far left-wing Guardian newspaper, which, as you know, is 100% very pro-Obama, they ran a headline which declared, Obama's North Korea engagement policy in tatters after North Korea rocket launch. In Gates, I'm sorry, not Bill Gates, but in former Secretary of Defense Gates's recent memoirs, he noted that Obama actually personally intervened to prevent the South Koreans from retaliating in a major way after the North shelled that island of theirs in 2010. Robert Gates is who I meant, not Bill Gates. This agreed framework history that I've gone into with you is highly relevant to what we're talking about now with Iran and their nuclear program, and that's the reason I'd like to discuss it with you. In light of this new nuclear deal that the administration has made with Iran. I was actually stunned and horrified. My mouth actually dropped when I learned that one of the individuals who was deeply involved in reaching this recent agreement with Iran was someone by the name of Wendy Sherman. Wendy Sherman was a retread from the Clinton administration. I personally thought she would never serve in government again, but when Hillary became Secretary of State, she immediately appointed Sherman number 2 person at the State Department. The reason that I thought she would be too embarrassed ever to serve in government again, or that the press would raise some kind of a huge outcry, was that Wendy Sherman was one of the main architects and defenders of the agreed framework with North Korea back in the 90s. So the Iran deal, which the administration just made, may turn out to be the same kind of disaster that the agreed framework was in the 90s with North Korea. Think about it, the same person who was duped by North Korea back then is now playing a major role with our negotiations over nukes with Iran. What could possibly go wrong with that kind of scenario? Another big backer of the recent nuclear deal with Iran is a far-left analyst named Joseph Cirincione. He was a top advisor to the Obama campaign on nuclear issues. He got in trouble because he denied it. He was caught lying about it. And he was recently appointed, Cirincione was appointed, as a top advisor on nuclear issues to Secretary of State John Kerry, which is very troubling to me because Cirincione has some really wacky views on some issues. And I'm not merely referring to the fact that he's very anti-missile defense. What I'm referring to is that he's somewhat of a conspiracy theorist. What I mean by that is, you may all remember in 2007, the North Koreans were building in Syria a North Korean nuclear plant. It was staffed by North Korean technicians. The North Koreans built it. And you may also remember that the Israeli Air Force struck it and destroyed it in 2007. When this happened, Cirincione piped up and he said, in some bizarre conspiracy theory, that there was no nuclear plant being built there, that the North Koreans weren't involved because there was no plant, and even he said that the Israelis, of course, didn't bomb it because the whole thing never happened. It was all some myth. And this is the gentleman who is advising our government on nuclear issues. Almost unbelievable. There are certain Democrats who have ties to and who support pro-North Korean groups, and in some cases North Korea itself, and this is a quite disturbing and serious problem here domestically, politically. In California, in other states, in DC, there are pro-North Korean groups which are actually lobbying, actively lobbying, certain Democratic senators and representatives, pushing them toward pro-North Korean policies. And they sometimes meet with them, and they get very warm receptions from a few of these politicos. Some of the biggest North Korea supporters with friendly ties to these pro-North Korean groups here in the US are former Congressman Dennis Kucinich of Ohio, In California, the Marxist Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I'll explain to you why I call her a Marxist. It's not a pejorative, it's a descriptive label. And Mike Honda from Northern California. As a matter of fact, Congresswoman Lee and Congressman Honda, their names appeared in the official newspaper of the US Communist Party a couple of years ago. They were praised in the Communist Party newspaper, which said that we need more people in Congress like Barbara Lee and Mike Honda. Both of these two individuals have made pro-North Korean statements, which they inserted into the congressional record at the behest of pro-North Korean groups here in the US. I alluded to Lee being a Marxist a moment ago. Just a moment about her background. She originally started out as a member of the Black Panthers terrorist group, and the reason that I referred to her as a Marxist is because after the Soviet Union fell, you had the mainline Communist Party, but there was a split in the CPUSA, the Communist Party USA. As a result of that split, a small splinter Marxist-Leninist group emerged called the Committees of Correspondence. It wasn't a liberal group, it wasn't a left-wing group, it wasn't a leftist progressive group, it was a Marxist-Leninist communist group. On the national board of that group, the Committees of Correspondence, was Barbara Lee. Also, she was a member during the 1980s of a Soviet front group. You all remember the Soviet peace movement, which they were waging in the US and Europe back in the 80s, trying to prevent nuclear missiles being placed in Europe. There was a notorious Soviet international front group called the World Peace Council. They had a US branch called the US Peace Council. Even the US Congress identified them as a Soviet front. Barbara Lee was on the board of that peace council. She used to work for Congressman Ronald Dellums, an extreme left-wing congressman up in the Bay Area. She was working for him at the time of the U.S. liberation of the island of Grenada back in 1983. And those of you who were around in the Reagan administration or who know of Reagan's policies will find this little tangent that I'm going off on fascinating, because at that time Lee was a staffer to Dellums, and that's when all the brouhaha, all the controversy about Grenada came up. The U.S. suspected, rightly it turns out, we know from the archives of that country, that the Soviets, the Cubans, the East Germans, the North Koreans were building up Grenada into a new base in the Caribbean, building huge military facilities there, what have you, to spread subversion in the region. Congressman Dellums, by some unfortunate mistake of Congress, was assigned the role, I suppose he was working on some armed forces related committee, of drafting a report for the US government on whether or not this was true. And when he drafted his preliminary version of this report, what his staff, Barbara Lee did, was send a draft of the report to the communist government in Grenada, asking them for any comments which they might deem necessary on this report, which was being submitted to the US government. She also betrayed some freedom fighters in Grenada, because at that time, while the communists were still in power, a letter arrived in Dellums' office from a dissident in Grenada saying, we're being oppressed by the communists here. You know, they're watching all your medical students in Grenada. We've got secret police from East Germany and North Korea training a Gestapo-like organization here repressing the people. When Lee and her folks in Dellums' office got a hold of this letter from a dissident in Grenada, they didn't turn it over to the US government. They wrote to the Communist Party of Grenada and they said, be careful, comrades, there's a traitor in your midst. Now, you're probably wondering how I know all of this information. I'm not privy to any government classified information, but this all came out because when we liberated Grenada, we liberated all the internal archives of the communist rulers. So we have this all in black and white. It's a US government printing office document. Just recently, to finish up with our friend, Congresswoman Lee, she attempted to meet, just in 2013, a fellow by the name of Abdul Naimi, but the meeting was canceled at the last minute because the government informed her that he was an Al-Qaeda funder. This is the kind of person she was palling around with. She's extremely anti-Israel. That's demonstrated by the fact that J Street endorsed her. And Congressman Lee, along with Congressman Conyers, Congressman Honda, and Congressman McDermott of Washington State, McDermott being of Washington State, were among the 54 Democrats who in 2009, during the war between Israel and the terrorists in Gaza, 54 Democrats, including those aforementioned, signed the notorious pro-Hamas letter that they sent to Obama, you know, stop the Israeli offensive, start giving aid to Gaza. There were 54 Democrats who signed that, some of whom, as I just mentioned, are involved with pro-North Korean groups. The pro-North Korean groups met, as I mentioned, with Jim McDermott of Washington State. You may remember during the Iraq War, or just before the Iraq War, I should say, just in the lead up to the war, he went on a propaganda tour, a pro-Saddam tour of Iraq, which he claimed was being paid for by nonprofits and church and peace organizations, but he was later tremendously embarrassed when it turned out we discovered that it was being funded, Congressman McDermott's trip, by Saddam's intelligence services. John Conyers meets with the pro-North Korean groups. He, back in 1983, if you may recall, the Soviets shot down that Korean airliner in 1983, KAL Flight 007. You may remember there was a big international crisis when they shot that down. Conyers was one of the 2 members of Congress at that time who refused to condemn the Soviets for that act of aerial terrorism. In 2005, he held a big anti-war event on Capitol Hill. He invited some real left-wing fanatical groups, so fanatical that even the Washington Post, that Conyers' little seminar that he held, was an open forum for anti-Semitism. It was so bad, they were actually handing out caricatures of Jews, anti-Semitic tracts at this event that Conyers had on the Hill. Howard Dean actually had to apologize for it to the American people at that time, but Conyers never did apologize for that openly anti-Semitic event which he hosted. Barbara Boxer was actually, our own senator, was the last holdout in voting a decade ago for a North Korean human rights bill, which Congress wanted to pass, which the Senate wanted to pass. They wanted to make it unanimous, to send a clear message to North Korea: we don't approve of the way you're persecuting and terrifying your own people. She actually did end up voting for it, but she was the last holdout because members of her staff had been meeting with these pro-North Korean groups which were pushing her against it. Then there's a gentleman from Illinois, a senator who I refer to as a lowlife, named Richard Durbin. And the reason I call him a lowlife is nothing personal. The reason I call him a lowlife is that he said several years ago, U.S. troops are Nazis. And in my humble opinion, anyone who says U.S. troops are Nazis is a lowlife. And that's one of the more polite things I can say about him. Enough about him. Barney Frank of Fannie and Freddie Mac fame. Remember, no problem with Fannie and Freddie Mac. In 2006, 2007, they're doing just fine. He met with pro-North groups. Ron Wyden of Oregon. He had a staffer, actually, interestingly, 10 years ago. Someone on his staff was arrested. They found out she was working for Saddam Hussein 10 years ago. She was an agent of Iraqi intelligence. Senator Tom Udall, Senator Jim Webb of Virginia, our own Dianne Feinstein. You know, her husband has a number of very close business ties to People's Republic of China. She met with some of these pro-North groups. And then there's the great hero of the Vietnam War, our own John Kerry, currently Secretary of State. He actually attended a meeting of pro-North Korean groups which was held on Capitol Hill. And I was thinking maybe he was having like a flashback and thought he was back in his old glory days of accusing U.S. troops of fake and made-up war crimes in Vietnam. Recently, however, I have to give Secretary of State Kerry some credit because he was in South Korea and he did actually say when he was there, as Bush had done a decade earlier, that evil things were going on in North Korea. And I give Secretary of State credit for that. However, I wish Mr. Kerry, 10 years ago, had not criticized and condemned and slandered George Bush for saying exactly the same thing, or at least apologized to him now. Here in California, Governor Brown surprisingly has a very close relationship with a pro-North Korean group and its leaders. The name of the group is Code Pink. You might have heard of them if you ever watched C-SPAN, seeing them disrupting congressional hearings and attacking people, a radical left-wing feminist group. The leader of Code Pink, Jody Evans, was actually Brown's chief of staff in the past. And when he ran for governor, she had a big fundraising shindig for him at her house in Santa Monica, and she's very close to him, apparently. The Code Pink organization actually sends friendship visits, friendship delegations to North Korea. They've pledged, in case of war, that they would actually serve as human shields to defend North Korea. And they also visit South Korea. What they do in South Korea is they go to the U.S. military bases there and they heckle and they scream insults at our soldiers there serving in South Korea. So I guess I could also use the term lowlifes to apply to these folks. You may recall, one of the other reasons that I refer to them as lowlifes, you may recall that Ahmadinejad of Iran, when he was in office, he visited the U.S. on a couple of occasions. One time was in 2007. And on that occasion, he had a reception for some local left-wing bigwigs in New York, anti-American, anti-Israel types, and Code Pink was there. The leader, Jody Evans, this person who was Brown's chief of staff, who he remains very close to, was there. And after the meeting with him, Fox News asked her, what did you think of Ahmadinejad? And Jody Evans said, well, all this stuff you hear in the U.S. media about him is all not true. I met with him, and I can tell you this man is all about justice, and he's all about human rights. While our troops were fighting in Iraq, actually, Code Pink went to Iraq during that period of extreme danger, but they didn't go there to provide aid and comfort or support to our troops. It wasn't a USO show by any stretch of the imagination. They went there armed with letters to smooth their passage through Jordan and neighboring countries to get there, from Congressman Waxman and Senator Boxer, to kind of ease their path on this little delegation that they sent there. But in their own words, they went to Iraq to help, quote unquote, the other side, meaning the terrorists. That's who they wanted to give aid and comfort to. Code Pink is very active in the BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. Sometimes I've seen clips of them on news programs or on C-SPAN, what have you, physically attacking pro-Israel speakers at trade fairs. You know, when some representatives of the Ahava cosmetics firm go down to some trade show, they'll show up and start screaming at them and yelling at them. They're actually notorious, Code Pink, for these kind of physical attacks. You'll see them sometimes on C-SPAN being thrown out of congressional hearings because they try to throw blood on people or something like that. On the topic of BDS, before I leave Code Pink, I'd just like to mention that there was one Danish bank which was a very strong leader in the BDS movement. They were favoring boycotting Israel, and they tried to get other banks throughout Europe to boycott Israel. About a month ago, it was discovered that this very same BDS-loving Danish bank was found to be financing a North Korean company which was supporting and providing missile sales to Iran in their missile program. So boycott Israel, but help Iran get nukes, was the philosophy of this European bank, apparently. What I found in my study over several decades of these pro-North Korean groups is that if you scratch a pro-North Korean activist, whether it's in South Korea, whether it's in the US, you'll always find, without exception, not only an anti-American, but an anti-Israel activist. And in some cases, you'll also discover a vicious anti-Semite. There are some pro-North Korean groups, though, you have to be careful for because they have quite misleading names. For example, there's a group called Veterans for Peace, which is not so much a veterans group as it is a Marxist group. They officially claim that the US and South Korea started the Korean War. They deny, they're 9/11 truthers. They deny the 9/11 attacks. There's this crazy leader of this group who visits North Korea often, who actually lost his legs in the 1980s. But I can't thank him for losing his legs in the service of our country because he didn't. How did he lose his legs in the 80s? He was a big opponent of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is a fascist and he's building up the US military and we've got to stop him. So he threw himself in front of a military train in the 80s, and of course trains have trouble barreling down a track, stopping in time if someone lies down the track. Unfortunately, it ran over his legs and now he has no legs. But when that happened, instead of being viewed as someone who's slightly off mentally, our own Senator Boxer made a cause célèbre of him. She considered him a hero. She wanted to have hearings on his behalf in Congress. His group, Veterans for Peace, is stridently anti-Israel. They actually have issued a call for Israeli soldiers to mutiny and turn their guns against the Israeli government, and they pay for anti-billboards in various places in the US. Sandra Fluke is a name that you may recall if you follow US politics. She was the young lady who spoke at the Democratic National Convention, and she testified before Congress about the need for all of us taxpayers to fully fund her birth control. What you may not know is, you may recall that she was a law student, but she was campus representative of her law school of a group known as the National Lawyers Guild. The National Lawyers Guild is one of the oldest and notorious communist fronts in the US. Back in the 30s, they were big supporters of Stalin with all of his purges and mass slaughters, and they remain today a pro-communist group, and they're very close to the government of North Korea, very supportive of the North. They send friendship delegations there for North Korean holidays. Interestingly, although it's a group of lawyers, they actually defend the North Korean quote-unquote legal system. Now, the North Korean legal system is one in which, according to the North Korean's own description, the role of the defense attorney is to ensure that his traitorous client gets due punishment from the people. And this is an organization which American lawyers sworn to uphold our civil and political rights are actively defending. That's pretty bizarre in itself. This group, National Lawyers Guild, actually participates in the Kim Il-sung cult. They once likened Kim Il-sung to George Washington, and it also is a very anti-Israel group, stridently anti-Zionist. It was recently reported that Fluke, who, as I mentioned, was a campus representative of this National Lawyers Guild, may run for state legislature on the west side of LA, so West LA may soon be represented by someone who is a member of a pro-North Korean and anti-Israel group. There are several Democratic senators and representatives who we would see during the period of Iraq War, 2002 roughly to 2007, slightly before the Iraq War and before it ended, who would attend large anti-war rallies in some of our major cities, New York and Washington. I would see them all the time on C-SPAN. Maybe you noticed some of them. But what you may not have realized is some of these major anti-war rallies, which were held in the nation's capital, were organized by a Marxist-Leninist, a communist group known as the Workers' World Party. And you would see some of these Democratic senators and Democratic representatives on the podium standing there with these top cadres, these top leaders of the Workers' World Party, chatting with them, slapping on the back, yucking it up with them. Of course, I don't know if they knew that they were from the Workers' World Party. That's a different issue. But the Workers' World Party is a group which is totally devoted to North Korea, being a Marxist-Leninist organization. They visited the North dozens of times, and they're fully into the worship of the Kim family as gods. The Workers' World Party has two notorious front organizations controlled by their party, International Answer, which you may see their sign even some local events in LA, if you see on the bottom International Answer, or International Action Center. They're both pretty much controlled by the Marxist-Leninist Workers' World Party. They also all happen to be, both the Workers' World Party and these two front groups, stridently anti-Israel. You can see them more often at an anti-Israel event than you can at a pro-North Korea event. There's a leader of a pro-North Korean group here in LA, which was actually invited to speak at a Los Angeles Korean American Democratic Club in 2006. I would have thought he would have been persona non grata. There are also some leading pro-North Korean figures in LA. When I checked their political contributions, they were donating to various Democrats, especially Senator Boxer and President Obama. In the past, when I was in Korea, they would have political activities there for US expats. They'd have a Republicans abroad and a Democrats abroad. When I was there, I remember that Democrats abroad leader in Korea had his own website. And on his website, I remember seeing he had posted a video which claimed that Al-Qaeda never existed. It was a myth, all this bin Laden business. At that time, I remember Jimmy Carter was the honorary chairman of Democrats abroad. More recently, I checked back on their website, and they still had, although of a different nature, some North Korean propaganda on their site. Michael Moore, our rotund friend, in one of his books about a decade ago, actually had some nice things to say about Kim Jong-il. He said, oh, he's turning over a new leaf, everything will be fine with North Korea now. His Fahrenheit 9/11 conspiracy film was praised by North Korea when it came out, and it was actually shown, they screened his film here in the US, pro-North Korean groups did, and in Korea, pro-North Korean groups in South Korea screened his film because they enjoyed the conspiratorial nature of it so much. Michael Moore, you may remember, has said that once that the PLO should have access to, we should give them our top weapons, some of our most dangerous and lethal weapons, because he thought that the Palestinian terrorists needed to even things up with the Israelis. Moore is planning, reputedly, according to reports, to be making an anti-Israel propaganda film. That was in the work, that's in the works, according to a report I saw late last year. Oliver Stone, another wacky director, you may know him because he just recently last year made a revisionist documentary all about the Cold War. And the whole point of this documentary was to blame the US for the Cold War. Joseph Stalin was just a peace-loving gentleman who wanted to get along with the US, but the warmongering Americans destroyed this chance for peace. He visits South Korea, and he goes there to protest against the South Korean military. He apparently doesn't think they exist or should exist, or that they should be pared down as our military is being pared down. His conspiracy theory in this regard, because you know Stone always has a conspiracy theory, he says the US and South Korea militaries are secretly planning to attack China, and he has to stop it. So he goes to South Korea to protest at South Korean military bases. You may remember Mr. Stone in 2010 said the greatest danger facing the United States today was Jewish domination of the US media. And that's a pretty good Goebbels imitation if you think about it. You don't actually think of him as a rich little type, but that's a good imitation of Joseph Goebbels. I guess he never watches MSNBC or CNN if he thinks the US media is too pro-Israel. Robert Scheer is a USC professor, and he was a former LA Times columnist. You might have seen his columns from time to time, Scheer's columns in the LA Times. He was also known as a kind of a political advisor to Barbra Streisand. He visited North Korea as early as 1970 on a Black Panther group delegation which went there. After he returned to the US, he was so enthralled with what he had seen in the North, he said that North Korea is the freest, the most wonderful society in the world under the great leader Kim Il-sung. The Panthers actually did terrorist training in the North when they were there at various times after they had to flee from the US after getting in trouble with the law here, and they actually wrote the foreword to a book of Kim Il-sung's works here back many years ago. Of course, this being Hollywood, I shouldn't neglect our useful idiot Hollywood folks. Robert Redford, the actor-director, and Gloria Steinem, who's also an actress and a feminist leader, they are participating currently in a campaign against the South Korean military. Apparently, they have no interest in human rights in North Korea. And before I get off the subject of Hollywood idiots, I just have to go on another little tangent to remind us all of Vanessa Redgrave. You remember, she was one of the original Israel-hating celebrities back in the 70s when she got an Oscar. She went up on stage and she denounced those dirty Zionists and what have you. She was one of the first of that trend. And I was recently reading something fascinating about her I wanted to share with you. Many years ago, perhaps not too long ago, she was doing an interview and she was speaking about her great hero Fidel Castro because she idolizes the communist regime there. She was saying the reason that she adores Fidel Castro so much Vanessa Redgrave said, is because he was a great friend and colleague of, they worked very closely together, Jose Marti, the famous the famous Cuban patriot, who is revered as a national hero in Korea. Because Castro was so close with him and because he enjoyed the trust of Castro, that's why she respected Castro so much. Of course, this was very difficult for Castro and Marti to achieve, this link-up, this friendship, because Jose Marti, the Cuban national hero, died in 1895, and Fidel Castro was born in 1926. So right there's the danger of listening to a Hollywood leftist idiot talk about history or any other matter for that reason. Unfortunately, I have to report to you that there are certain religious denominations in the US which are very sympathetic to North Korea, in some cases openly supportive of North Korea. These happen to be, I regret to say, the Unitarians, the Quaker movement, in some respect, the United Methodists, who allow pro-North Korean events to be held in their churches, and some elements of the Presbyterian Church. You know, the Presbyterians from time to time are dealing with movements to boycott Israel. Their church in LA actually happens to support pro-North Korean events, sad to say. In 2013, the liberal website Politico was actually praised by the North Korean media because of something they had written, but the absolute favorite journalist of the North Koreans in the US was the late Helen Thomas, our old Jew-hating friend Helen Thomas. North Koreans adore her. They praised her recently in their media. The person who the North Koreans probably hate most in the US, now that President George W. Bush is out of office, because he was their number1 target, the person who they now hate the most is John Bolton. There's not a time that they don't mention him, and they mention him every few months, that they don't say, John Bolton, human scum, John Bolton. So that says a lot for John Bolton. Made me even more of a fan than I already was. I was just recently looking at some of the North Korean media, which I monitor regularly, and just this past week they had a large editorial. They're starting to feel the pressure from some of the human rights activists that are getting on their case for the horrific way in which they treat their own people. And they ran a big editorial on one of their English language websites, the North Koreans did, and the gist of their editorial is the US is the human rights graveyard of the world. There are no human rights in the US, and the reason that they knew this was because in the US there's tremendous social and income inequality. Do those words ring a bell? Too much income inequality in the US. That's how we know that they're not a paragon of human rights, so they have no right to lecture us. There's a local Marxist here in the LA area, a pro-North Korean activist named Frank Durrell, who wrote a little comic book history of America over the past couple of centuries called Addicted to War, and it basically blames the US for starting every war that the US has ever been involved in, and it also blames us for the Korean War, naturally. The interesting thing about this book, and the reason I mention it is not only because he's very actively supporting North Korea, is that his book has been approved by school districts in San Francisco and some other California cities for use in public schools. This book was praised and supported as being promoted by Susan Sarandon and Ed Asner. When President Bush was in the White House, he actually made a point of welcoming escapees from North Korea, defectors who had escaped, into the White House. He met with several of them and feted them there. One thing that I worry about a little is, though I don't in any sense believe that President Obama is in any way pro-North Korea, I do worry about some of the influence on him when I was younger, because reading one of his autobiographies, one of President Obama's autobiographies, I note that one of his mentors growing up in Hawaii, you might have heard of Frank Marshall Davis. And Frank Marshall Davis, in case you haven't heard of him, he was a communist activist, a Communist Party cadre in Hawaii, but he was living there and writing for communist newspapers at the time of the Korean War. And at that time, he was very gung-ho in support of North Korea, and he often praised North Korea in his newspaper columns. Of course, that was many years before he met President Obama in the 70s, but I hope there wasn't any influence which he exercised on the president at that time. My first personal contact with pro-North Korean forces here in LA came when I was an undergrad at UCLA in the 90s. There was actually a pro-North Korean local leader who was allowed to teach a class there, which is puzzling in itself. But in his class, he claimed things like, for example, when the North Koreans set off that bomb in Burma to kill all those South Korean politicians who were visiting, he claimed that the South Koreans themselves did that and blamed it on the North Koreans, kind of like Oliver Stone is wont to do. He also invited a speaker to the course who told us that communism, this was in the 80s, remember, that communism was the most successful system in the world. This professor actually operated in Koreatown a North Korean bookstore. It wasn't owned by North Korea, but it was filled with volume upon volume of the selected works, of the propaganda works in English and in Korean from North Korea. Now, the shop is closed down, so I wouldn't suggest that you rush out there and say, I need my copy of volume 18 of the selected works of Kim Jong-il. You won't find it. I guess there just wasn't enough demand in Los Angeles for the selected works of a foreign foreign dictator. Go figure. There's actually a pro-North Korean academic group for professors, Alliance of Scholars Concerned About Korea. Unfortunately, they're not a small group because they've wormed their way into control of some of the Korean studies centers at various universities, some of the top universities throughout the US. They have a presence at prestigious places like Johns Hopkins, at UCLA, at USC. Of course, we know the same problem in the Jewish community because some of the Jewish studies centers, if you've been following the issue, at some major US universities are controlled by some anti-Israel and extremist elements. These pro-North Korean professors, they actually use some of the funds they have by virtue of being professors to hold pro-North Korean activities both on and surprisingly also off campus, which I didn't think they were allowed to do. I visited, I remember about 2 decades ago, a North Korean photo exhibit when I was an undergrad in university. I wasn't a USC student, but I thought I'd travel over to enemy territory because in the SC library, I heard they were having a pro-North Korea photo exhibit. So I went down there to check it out, and I noticed they had a little sign-in desk with 2 pro-North Korean fanatical students sitting there, and I looked, they had a sign-in sheet, and I checked it out, and I saw that a number of professors at SC had all signed in. They listed their names and their affiliations to come and visit this pro-North Korean photo exhibit. And in front of the sign-in desk, they had a large photo, a large blown-up portrait of Kim Il-sung, who was still alive then, the great leader, and his son, Kim Jong-il, the dear leader. And it was surrounded by a garland of flowers. And they asked me, would you please, before you go into the exhibit, bow and show your respects to the great leader and the dear leader. And I said, wait a minute, I see on the sign-in list here that there are about a dozen USC professors who visited. You're asking me that you asked them to bow? And they said, oh, we not only asked them, but they voluntarily, they were very pleased to be able to bow to these great personages. I explained to them I wasn't able to bow to the photo of the great leader at this time because I had a weak back, so just let me go in and look at the photos. And the fanatics who were staffing it, because they are fanatics, they didn't trust my answer, and they were kind of following me around, keeping an eye on me, and they asked me very suspiciously, how long have you had this weak back? So I didn't know what to say, but I realized whenever you're in need of a good line, always go to the Three Stooges. Three Stooges always have a good line for everything, and I remembered Larry once used a line, and I repeated it to them. When they asked me, how long have you had this weak back? I said, oh, about a week back, and that kept them quiet. There's a fanatical pro-North Korean professor, keeping on the academic theme, at UC Santa Cruz, who in her spare time does very nice work. She teaches prison inmates, learn how to read, to educate them. But what she teaches them with are documents and texts supporting North Korea and supporting Kim Il-sung. She actually listed, or a sympathetic article about her listed, some of these texts that she's teaching these cons doing hard time about how they should be worshiping Kim Il-sung and not integrating back into US society. There's another one, which you may not be surprised to learn is at UC Berkeley, another professor, who actually had a vanity license plate done with a pro-North Korean slogan on it in English. The reason that I mention these 2 weirdos is that they both happen to be involved deeply in anti-Israel activities. They're professors of Asian studies. They both happen to be Korean-American individuals, and they got their academic group for Asian American studies to pass a boycott, divestment, sanctions resolution against Israel. They're members of a pro-North Korean group here in the US called the Korea Policy Institute. Very innocuous name, but very supportive of the dictatorship in North Korea. Probably the most famous of all the pro-North Korean professors, if you ever come across his name, because sometimes he does get books published in the mainstream market, is Professor Bruce Cummings, and he's a revisionist historian about North Korea. I remember after the 9/11 attacks, he was quoted as saying, this doesn't have anything to do with an upsurge in Islamic fundamentalism, that's just all a myth by the Bush administration. So that tells you all you need to know about him. There's actually one pro-North Korean leader of a pro-North Korean group based in New York, which during the summers recruits young Korean Americans and sends them to North Korea to be indoctrinated there. This same leader supports North Korea's nuclear program, but what I recently discovered about her, which was of tremendous interest, was this pro-North Korean individual just happens to have been one of the top leaders on the leadership council a few years ago of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So that certainly explains a lot. Of course, you remember Occupy Wall Street, that's the group that Nancy Pelosi said she loves so much. I guess she didn't realize that one of their leaders is a pro-North Korean fanatic. One of the top pro-North Korean leaders in Southern California lives on a quiet street over in Glendale. He's visited North Korea about 60 times in his career. He actually was allowed to write a book there denouncing America and South Korea. He recently wrote on his website, because a lot of these pro-North Korean groups have their own website, he recently wrote on it that the US is the most evil nation in the world. He's actually having a big ceremony in Koreatown next week. It happens to be his birthday, and he's celebrating many years of supporting North Korea. So all of the pro-North Korean folks throughout Southern California and even across the country are coming to visit him. I was looking at his website. He got a letter of greetings from the North Korean UN ambassador. That's how much they value him as a supporter of North Korea. He also happens to be stridently anti-Zionist. He participates in a lot of anti-Israel organizations. There's a pro-North Korean group in the field of lobbying. I alluded to you before. I actually didn't just allude, but I described in great detail about some of the U.S. Senators and congressmen who are being lobbied. One of the groups that does it is called the National Campaign to End the Korean War. They lobby the U.S. government and Congress in support of pro-North Korean policies, and they actually defended Rodman's trip to North Korea. A pro-US group, a pro-North Korean group rather, recently had a big conference at LAX. They brought in supporters of North Korea from all over the place. As I mentioned, they have their own website, so they're quite active. But I want to make it clear that they in no way, by a long stretch, do not represent the vast majority of Korean Americans. They're kind of like 911 truthers or deniers. They're a small but noisy group. I just want to make that clear. There are pro-North Korean and anti-South Korean, anti-American rallies, which are from time to time held in Koreatown. There are also counter rallies held by anti-North Korean folks, which I participated in. That's how I happen to know about these. At the pro-North rallies, usually held somewhere in the vicinity of, Wilshire and Olympic, or Wilshire and Western, that area, are usually populated by communist front groups, useful idiots who show up to these pro-North Korean events. I remember at one, there was a Korean-American lawyer who, when she saw our counter-demonstration denouncing the North, came up to us and started screaming, "Can't you understand?" She almost had tears in her eyes. "Can't you understand? The great leader, Comrade Kim Jong-un, is the finest human being who ever set foot on this earth." She was like a groupie. It was like she was screaming about Elvis, 40 years ago. And this was a lawyer. It was just absolutely bizarre. Some of the organizers of these pro-North Korean rallies deny that they're pro-North Korean. "Oh no, we don't have any communist links." They use the same modus operandi of some of the anti-Zionist Jewish groups. J Street, "Oh no, we're not anti-Zionist. We love the state of Israel." Pro-North Korean groups do use the same playbook. However, what I discovered was absolute proof that this is a lie, because several months before one of their big demonstrations in 2013, one of the big pro-North Korean demonstrations, I found that some of these groups which are denying they're pro-North actually met together to plan their event. And where did they meet? They met in the LA offices of the Workers' World Party, the Marxist-Leninist pro-North Korean organization. That's where they organized these pro-North Korean events. As a matter of fact, at some of these events, the leaders aren't even pro-Korean Americans who support the North. They're non-Korean members of the Workers' World Party. There's a comrade by the name of John Parker, who really loves Korea. He usually leads a lot of these pro-North Korean events. He's the communist leader on the west coast of the US. He's a person of interest because I found that he recently attended the Al-Ada, the Palestine Right of Return Coalition meeting down in Orange County, and he was quoted by their own newsletter as getting up and screaming, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," meaning, of course, the annihilation, complete annihilation of the state of Israel. The ADL actually identified this Workers' World Party cadre, pro-North Korean individual Parker. The ADL identified him as one of the top anti-Israel activists in the US. If any of you should ever be interested, if you missed the 1980s and like to see a good old-fashioned anti-communist demonstration, you can actually see one. You can come down to Koreatown, join one of the anti-North counter rallies we have. You can probably see this fellow, John Parker. You can ask him about his recent trip to Syria, where he's a guest of the Assad regime. You can ask him why he loves Iran's nuclear program so much. One bizarre fact that I noticed in my study over a couple of decades of these pro-North Korean groups and individuals is that they include more than their fair share of neo-Nazis and white supremacists. You wouldn't think so. After all, they have to call themselves progressives in public, but they do include some of these cranks. They engage in anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. They post Holocaust denial on their websites. Two individuals I'd like to single out are a Canadian professor, Michel Chossudovsky, and our own American comrade, John Paul Cupp. I'll start with Professor Chossudovsky. He was a professor emeritus up at the university up in Canada. He recently attended, to give you some idea about his way of thinking, he attended a big communist conference in Germany, and there he made a speech indicating the need for all countries around the world to immediately impose a legal ban on all pro-Israel organizations in their respective countries, write them out of existence. He also called for international war crimes, genocide trials against the state of Israel. On his website, which the B'nai B'rith of Canada has condemned strongly because they've said it's a welcome open forum for Holocaust deniers and racial hatred, on his website you can find things like hurricanes and odd weather patterns are secretly caused by Jews. John Paul Cupp, who's the American I referred to, he's a real case. He argues that the problem isn't the state of Israel or Zionism. He argues in best Hitlerian fashion, this supporter of pro-North Korea, that the real problem is Judaism itself, and that we can't adequately defend North Korea because Jews are such troublemakers involved with human rights groups. We can't adequately defend North Korea unless we make a final solution to the Jewish problem. That's what this fellow Cupp says on his website. I guess the key theme here is they like the idea of concentration camps. They support Nazi camps, they support North Korean camps. That's their thing in life. When Kim Il-sung met President Carter back in 1994, which I described to you earlier, there was actually a North Korean book, a North Korean work which described that meeting. Of course, they described it as a great victory and as Jimmy Carter coming to pay tribute to Kim Il-sung. But in their description of it, they reported that Kim Il-sung actually made several anti-Jewish slurs to Carter. This North Korean author reported that Kim Il-sung believed that Jews were treacherous people and that they influenced U.S. politics in a very negative way. But the book, however, doesn't disclose what Carter's answer was, if any. I'll leave that up to your imaginations. In 2013, you may have read the story, which was quite well publicized, that Kim Jong-un was distributing copies of Mein Kampf to some of his cronies in the leadership to give them leadership hints, how to kill people and alienate friends, that kind of a thing. You probably won't be shocked to learn that the Berkeley City Council passed last year a pro-North Korean resolution, which was being pushed by pro-North groups. I know that's not much of a news story. It's like saying the sun rises in the east, but there you have it. There's a pro-North Korean activist in New York City who's been involved in the very local grassroots level of democratic politics. He worked for the controller, a Chinese-American gentleman in New York City, and he's working his way up there. He may continue in New York City politics. I hope he doesn't, but he may, because I think he's a perfect fit for their new ultra-left Mayor de Blasio. You may remember Mayor de Blasio for his honeymoon, because he was such an admirer of the communist system in Cuba. He actually went to Cuba for his honeymoon with his wife. And this pro-North Korean gentleman who I'm telling you about did the opposite but similar act. He went to North Korea with his wife on their honeymoon. Can you imagine that? Honey, we're not going to Bahamas, we're going to Pyongyang. So he's a real fanatic. By the way, he was the founder and leader of the group I mentioned earlier, which every summer sends young Korean Americans to be brainwashed in North Korea, and whose head was the leader of the Occupy Wall Street movement. This fellow in New York is also very anti-Israel, and once again we have the same strand weaving through this narrative. He attends lots of Workers' World Party conferences. Now I've got what you've been waiting for. I've got for you the Rodman story with some of the juicy details. I have some new information. You may know that Rodman's trip to North Korea, the one that caused the big brouhaha, was not his first one. Last September, he actually went to the North with a delegation, and it was reported that one member of his group had a bizarre experience. He supposedly, according to his description, passed out and woke up naked in his hotel room the next morning without no memory of what happened. Unfortunately, there are no Anthony Weiner-style photos of this, so we'll never know what the truth was. But on this most recent trip, one of the players, Kenny Anderson, said he was actually terrified the entire time he was in the North, because when they arrived, they seized all their passports, so he was never sure if they'd let him out. The U.S. organizers of Rodman's trip, as you might have expected or suspected, were pro-North Korean individuals in the U.S. who have contacts in the North Korean government. They actually attacked the Christian missionary who's currently in prison there, Kenneth Bae. The organizers did, just as Rodman did when he was there. But besides attacking Bae when Rodman was there, you may not realize he also praised Kim Jong-un. He said he's a wonderful and friendly fellow who's being portrayed unfairly in the U.S. media. Jesse Jackson was one of the few people who came out big time in support of Rodman. Of course, Jackson also supports Arafat and Castro, so you have to take that for what it's worth. The good news is that Rodman may now be investigated by the U.S. Treasury and State Departments for possibly violating luxury goods sanctions against bringing in gifts of certain value to the North. We have sanctions. You're only allowed to bring in gifts worth a certain amount. But Kim Jong-un and his wife are fans of very expensive cognac and handbags and things of that nature, so they're investigating if he went over that limit. In theory, if he's charged and if he's convicted, he could spend up to 20 years in prison. Although you have to cut him a little slack. You know, I've described to you some pro-North Korean individuals. At least Rodman has the excuse that he was drunk at the time, which is not an excuse that the other pro-North Korean fanatics have. One of the most shocking but little known aspects of the Rodman trip, which didn't get covered in the media, is his support, Rodman's support, probably unknowingly, for North Korea's anti-black racism. In 2006, there was a football star, a wide receiver named Hines Ward. He played for the Steelers and for the University of Georgia, who visited South Korea with his mom, who's Korean. His mom is Korean, his father's African American, so he's of mixed race, half black, half Korean. In South Korea, he was celebrated as a, guy who made good, part Korean who had made good. A local boy made good. They feted him there, treated him as a hero, but the North Korean media went berserk with racist hatred. The official North Korean media attacked Ward. They attacked the good reception he got in South Korea. They attacked his mom. They said he's an example of how alien races are polluting the Korean peninsula. They also attacked him, of course, for being a mixed race. Mixed race people are in big trouble in North Korea. They're immediately done away with. In the border, there's something really reminiscent of Nazism that's going on, which is that if they find that a baby was sired by a Chinese father, they kill the baby because it's impure blood seeping into the great leader's nation. This was a clear case of North Korea's anti-black racism, but Rodman ignorantly expressed his admiration for these bigots. One really sick story about Rodman when he was there, which came from some defectors, is that some hotel staff where he was staying in North Korea reported that he was so out of his mind drunk that he was actually vomiting all over the hotel hallways and relieving himself, really sickening stuff. To move on from those less than happy topics, I personally have been working to get the conservative and the pro-Israel message out in the Korean American community locally. And I've especially been working in the local Korean American media. I got the local Korean American media for the first time to do an in-depth story about liberal media bias in the US. They actually reviewed Tim Gross-Close's book, Left Terms, and did a big write-up on it for the first time in the Korean American media, a large newspaper. I've been working also with some of the conservative groups also in Korea. One of the things I did was I got them to expose a large conservative magazine in Korea. I got to expose the gentleman who I mentioned earlier, Professor Chosedovsky, this pro-North Korea supporter who's anti-Israel and has a lot of Holocaust denial on his website. They wrote up an expose of him. Some of these magazines and websites in Korea have published some of my work, and I've been giving several lectures on topics similar to this one to the local Korean American community. At one such event in Koreatown, the sponsoring group got a call from a supporter of North Korea who threatened that if I dared to say anything disrespectful about the light of the world, the great leader, Generalissimo Kim Jong-un, I would regret it. So what I did was I gave my speech and I said, I must say with all due respect, I think Kim Jong-un is a filthy, murdering pig and tyrant, with all due respect. While there do exist Korean American conservative groups, pro-American, patriotic, pro-Israel groups, they focus largely on the struggle with North Korea, as you might imagine. Many of them are veterans of the Korean War, some of these Korean Americans. They don't speak English fluently, but they're really great folks. I try to break down the walls which exist between them and other conservative, other pro-American, other pro-Israel groups. They're fiercely patriotic individuals. At their meetings, they sing all the verses of the national anthem. They march out with the U.S. flag. They have a moment of silence for Americans who lost their life defending Korea. The Democratic Party, actually, I shouldn't leave them out, they also have Asian American outreach. They have a big Asian American outreach program, opposite side of what I'm doing. In 2012, their outreach organization director was a gentleman named M.D. Alam. He's a Muslim from Bangladesh, Bangladesh being in Asia. He's a close friend and appointee of DNC chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. That's supposedly how he got this job, to be the official Asian American point man for the party. During 2012, Mr. Alam got his name in the paper a lot during the campaign and before the campaign, the presidential campaign, because Mr. Alam would go around the country giving speeches and interviews in which he claimed that no Jews died in the attacks of 9/11 and hinting that the Jews had planned the attacks of 9/11. Now remember, this is the official outreach coordinator for the Democratic National Committee to Asian Americans. Even after all this happened, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, for some reason, refused to remove him from his post. I hope that I've given you tonight some insight into the disastrous North Korea policies of some Democrats and the ties which some liberals have to fanatical pro-North Korean groups, as well as the threat which North Korea poses to the US and to Israel and its support for terrorism. I'd now like to ask all of you, if you'd be so kind, to please buy my book. I'd like to ask you to do so, but I can't because I've never written any book. But since everyone always asks, buy my book, I thought it's obligatory, it's de rigueur to ask you to buy a book. Instead, if any of of you happen to know of any other organization which would be interested in hosting me to speak, that will be my recompense. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and also for your interest. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
How does a country so oppressive and restrictive become so technologically advanced in certain areas like nuclear weapons and missile technology?
Yes, I think the best answer to that is how do they become so technologically advanced in some areas when they're so backward in others, is because that's where their priority is and that's where they spend all their money. All of the resources that they have are channeled into those efforts. All of these illegal, illicit fundraising methods that they use, counterfeiting US currency, selling drugs, selling spare MiGs to Cuba, or having Cuban MiGs refurbished in their country like happened late last year. Every cent that they have goes as a priority into the military, into this development. Of course, they started out during the time of the Cold War when they had more aid from the Soviet Union and they were doing a lot of trade with the other East Bloc countries. So it's something that they started on a long time ago, but it's basically because they devote all their national efforts to this project.
Are they getting their education in China? Is that where, I mean...
Well, originally, if you're talking about nuclear, for example, a lot of their nuclear people were originally educated, you know, many years ago in the East Bloc, in the Soviet Union, so they had experts who were trained overseas.
Gain power?
He actually was a low-level, middle-level guerrilla fighter. When Korea was occupied by the Japanese, he was over the border in China fighting as a guerrilla with some Chinese guerrillas, resistance fighters against Japan. And he eventually moved to the Soviet Union because he was also a communist simultaneously. And he served in the Soviet army. He was trained by the Soviets. They set him up in a special kind of all-Korean unit, which they were hoping they would use, just like they used Poles and Romanians and other East Europeans. They trained them in anticipation of their moving into Eastern Europe as who would form this new cadre of elites. They did the same with Kim Il-sung. So he was in the Soviet Union being trained. He actually served in the Soviet military. And then when the Soviet forces went into North Korea, they brought him in and they used him. Of course, not only him, there were actually ethnic Koreans living in the Soviet Union who had migrated there over you know, the period of Japanese rule, just like there are Jews living in various countries throughout the world. There was a diaspora of Koreans like you have them in the US. There were some in China and the Soviet Union who were available to the communists to use as their initial seed cadre. And when they moved into North Korea, they put them in power, and then eventually Kim Il-sung purged all these other folks who were working for the Soviets, and he came out the winner and imposed his one-man dictatorial system.
PBS about 2 months ago had a documentary about how awful North Korea was.
Yes.
How terrible human rights. What a bad country it was. How come these liberal people are still on this side? Didn't that sway them? Are they selectively watching their own media?
Well, I should say, first of all, I didn't mean to impugn all of the liberals in general. I mean, there are actually, I understand the gist of your question. I just wanted to say, for full disclosure, there are actually liberals who are part of the fight against the human rights oppression that goes on in North Korea. But the shocking thing is that there are so many, relatively speaking, on the left, especially on the far left, who are supportive of North Korea. Basically, some do it for ideological reasons, and that is that some of them are Marxists, and they see this as one of the last remaining outposts of a communist society in the world, and they will defend it against all comers. Others are just purely anti-Americans. It's not so much that they love North Korea. They may admit to you privately, well, I don't like the way Kim Il-sung is running things. It's terrible that all their people are being starved to death and put in concentration camps. But you have to remember, they're the only people standing up to the Americans, and they're putting us in our place. And if it weren't for them, the neocon right-wingers would have a clean sweep in Asia. So there are those kind of people. And finally, there's the third category, the useful idiots, the people who actually believe the North Koreans when they spout words about peace and unification and things like that. So there are basically those three kinds of categories that supporters of the North fall into.
Another question. Forgot it.
We can come back.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
go, please.
Does North Korea or South Korea have a problem with Muslim population?
That's a very good question. Actually, North Korea is a very tightly controlled society, a very restrictive society. So there are a few Muslim states that they have diplomatic relations with, but the expat community in general is very, very small. And that's a country where Big Brother is watching you 24 hours a day if you're Korean, and if you're happen to be non-Korean, they're watching you 24 hours a day plus. So there would be no way of any kind of that problem in North Korea. In South Korea, it's a little bit of a different story. They're an open democracy, and they have relations with countries all over the world. They have a decent-sized Muslim, Arab, Persian, what have you, expat community there. And they did have some problems from time to time, which were reported. I remember seeing reports in the Korean media, English language translations, that the South Korean security had uncovered a Taliban cell in this city, or they were watching these people because they were extremists, things of that nature. There haven't been really any terrorist attacks there because they have the sense enough to watch these people closely. They don't have left-wing and Islamist pressure groups that are pushing the government, no, don't watch these extremists like we do have here in the US. They take the threat seriously and they watch them very closely, and they wouldn't stand for that kind of nonsense because of their national security concerns, unlike us.
So they haven't had any terrorists?
Not major terrorist actions. There were Korean missionaries who were kidnapped or attacked from time to time in Arab countries, and the South Koreans get very upset about that. I mean Christian missionaries. But within Korea itself, I can't think of any major terrorist incidents. There are from time to time, as I said, reports of nests of extremists who they clear out, but so far nothing spectacular, thank goodness.
Do you know, or do you believe that North Korea's government has funded perhaps any American presidential libraries or American university groups or independent films? Do you believe that there's money coming from the North Korean government into the coffers of people who are always raising money and support them?
I can't say I have any information about politicians receiving money from them. I know that some of the agents, I know from the case of the gentleman who I mentioned who was arrested as a North Korean agent, the reason they actually got him was not because he was in the Pentagon at night, he didn't break in with a coat and cap and secretly photographing secret documents. They got him because he was visiting a North Korean embassy in Europe and he was secretly bringing in cash above the legal limit to fund his activities. So there are those kinds of things going on. I don't know of any with regard to politicians, but I do know that there are pro-North Korean groups which you mentioned films, which are making films which are sympathetic to the North and engaging in other activities, and there certainly is a lot of suspicion that they're in some way being aided or getting funding from the North. Thankfully, the U.S. government, I would assume, is keeping an eye on that and making sure that that this doesn't go on. But there are a lot of suspicions among those like myself who follow these groups that there is some funding that's coming from the North, because a lot of these folks, as I mentioned to you, and some of the individuals I described, visit North Korea quite frequently, and they have access to financial resources from the North, I would assume.
You had mentioned if you scratch a North Korean sympathizer, you'll find an anti-Israeli person and an anti-Semite, and you even alluded to Nazis. What do you think motivates these people to be against for North Korea but opposing the other?
Well, that I would say is part of their worldview. Alluding to my earlier question, some of these people are Marxist ideologues, and they oppose Israel for the same reason that they would oppose South Korea or oppose the U.S. They see Israel as an imperialist, aggressor, capitalist state, which should theoretically have some kind of revolution or be destroyed by progressive Arabs or by left-wing forces. So it's really ideological. It's not the religious-based anti-Israel extremism that we see with radical Muslims. It's more of an extreme left ideological motivation, I would say.
North Korea has an interesting balance sheet. They spend a lot of money and their GDP is minuscule. Do you, in your looking at North Korea, can this stay as a stable state of nature, or are they at a tipping point where they're going to just fail for lack of money?
Yes, economically speaking, they always manage to squeeze out of their nation or their populace that extra amount of money that they need to survive. Of course, they've been cut off from a lot of the aid that they used to receive from the communist bloc in the Cold War. They have other ways of making money. They try to, sell their missiles to countries like Iran and other places like that. But that really, over the long term, as you said, short of economic development, that won't be enough to sustain them. That's why every year, experts on North Korea who follow their economy and their political situation are expressing the hope or the prediction that any day now it can't go on like this, they're just going to implode from within. But the level of totalitarian control is so oppressive and so thoroughgoing and so professional in a bad way that they're able to keep such a tight rein on their population that until recently they've been able to keep out all extraneous influences or knowledge of the outside world, keeping it a very tightly ruled garrison state, even surpassing Mao's China or Stalin's Russia. So it remains to be seen how long they can keep on going until they finally just collapse. However, I should say people have been expecting them to collapse since the late 1980s, but they keep on trudging through.
Is there any leakage of Twitter or Facebook or any sort of communication in and out of the country?
Well, there are defectors who make their way through China to America or South Korea or third countries, and they provide a lot of information. They have information sources.
Going into
No, they're leaving North Korea. They're leaving North Korea. And of course, we have stories from them. And also, there's an effort to get outside culture, outside ideas, to infiltrate those into the North so that it can open the eyes of the people there as the fact that they're not living like everyone else in the world. They'll send balloons over with pictures of magazines from Seoul. This is what it's like. You're not living in a people's paradise. People actually do have enough to eat in other countries. So there are efforts to kind of awaken and to expose the North Korean people to developments in the outside world. But as for internet, they're so tightly restricted. They have their little internal internet LAN system which they use, but they certainly would not, if you're a government-approved person, if you're a high-ranking individual or a student of some kind, but you certainly don't have any access to the kind of outside information that people in other countries would. Yes.
What surprised me when you mentioned that Russia, after the war, had supported military part of North Korea, that they gave them the ammunition and everything. Because knowing the Eastern Europe countries, even though they had their army and everything, but the army did not have any kind of bullets, because when Russia invaded Czechoslovakia, even though Czechoslovakia had the army and wanted to fight the Russians, they found out that their bullets and everything were not working, that they really didn't, the guns were not unusable, they had no bullets, and yet it kind of surprises me that North Korea has that military support from Russia.
Well, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the situation was a little different than in Europe in one sense. In one sense, it was similar because the Soviets imposed their own system on this country as they did in the East European states. In the sense that it was different was that these countries had been, in many cases, independent, in almost every case independent, before being brought into the Soviet orbit, and they had their own militaries, their own military traditions, their own armed forces, even their own military industries. In the Korean Peninsula, it was a colony of Japan since the early 1900s. So for 35 plus years, there was no military establishment of any kind other than the Japanese occupiers. So in other words, the Soviets really had to establish some kind of military force there, which we did in the South to a very, very minimal degree. The only problem was the Soviets built up a military force strong enough to launch a massive invasion of the South. I heard that. Some experts are denying that that was a true report. However, it is similar to things that have come out of the North before and which we know are true. You can see even on YouTube some translations of North Korean propaganda videos from about, I don't know, 7-10 years ago, where they do have these keep your haircut campaign, keep your haircut in the socialist style, don't adopt the bourgeois style of haircut. So there is that kind of pressure from time to time, but the exact story about copying his hair may or may not be true, but there is that kind of precedent. That's how ever-present the level of totalitarian control is, down to haircuts.
That's a really good ending. Thank you so much, Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.